Hi, and welcome back to episode 3 of Learning the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War series. My name's Patrick, and in this episode, I'm going to focus completely and totally on the mechanics of moving your units around the map here. How we get all of these forces into place, into position, so that you can actually execute battle against the enemy. And that is really the biggest part of this game. It is an operations level game, so maneuver is very important. As I've done in the previous episodes, what I want to first show you before we actually get into the mechanics of how to move is I want to give you another web resource that you can use here. Today I want to talk about the Consim World website and show you a little bit about that. This is an excellent place for you to find other users so that you can having a little trouble with my webs here. This is a great place to find out, one, all of the happenings of the war game industry and specific titles that you may be interested in. And the Great Campaign series is no exception to that. There is a fantastic forum on here that has quite a wide user base. And there's actually the old style forum, which I'm going to show you first, and then there's a social page much like Facebook, so that you can actually get on there and get connected with other players of the system. But first and foremost, let's show you the more diehard users of Consim World know about the forum series system here. And I want to show you that. I want to bring that up first. This is organized by thematic system and by games. If you're like me and you have an account with Consim World, you already have certain titles already subscribed to. That's really the most efficient way to keep abreast of what's going on. So I can click read messages here and go right to, it will jump me through all of the different titles that I have saved. Or you can just work your way down from the master index here. And the Great Campaign series is going to be in its own category here under American Civil War. And within that, all the titles are sorted. I've gone into the preferences and sorted mine by title here. The Great Campaign series is down here in the G, not to be confused with the Great Battles of the American Civil War series. And I want to thank Richard Berg for his shout out today. But the Great Campaign series is right here, and you click on that, and that will bring you to the actual series fora here. And you can see this one has about 8,500 messages in it, going back probably to 2000 or 2001. And so you can see the current ones, and since it's just a streaming index, it just keeps you just sequentially with all of them. But right up here at the top, and every single one of these fora, you will see probably some general resources related to the game in question. This one you can see all the title information of the different series games, and then over here you actually see some of the resources that Ed Beach and Jay Myers, which I pointed out a couple episodes ago, have put. So there's quick links here to get to some of that. And if you're willing to spend a little bit of time here, you can actually go back to a previous series, and you can see there are a lot of familiar names in here that you may see. Ed Beach is obviously, since he's the series designer currently, he is a very active participant here in the board, so it's quick, very quick response to a lot of questions that come up. And rules questions are probably the most common thing that are shared here. But this is a terrific resource, so I encourage everybody to go out there and check out Consim World. Some find it a little daunting, perhaps not as easy to use as the layout of Board Game Geek, but I find both of them quite good. So definitely take a look at it, and you have a lot of resources there. The next thing I want to show you here on the Consim World site, I'm going to go back a couple of steps here to the main page, and take you right back out to the main Consim World site. More recently, just in the last few years, there's actually a social side of Consim World that's been established, where you can set up your account, create a profile, put an avatar in, and connect with different gamers, much like a social media site. And you can see here with my page, I will have Obviously, I'm not logged in here at the moment, but with my page, it will have the groups that I belong to, and the Great Campaign Series has a group already set up and lots of users already in it. So it's a good way to connect to folks and ask questions that way too if you don't want to use the actual forum. So by clicking the groups here, you can interact and see all the ones that have been preset. You can see a lot of them are specialty, either geographically or social clubs that already exist, or specialty ones that may have something to do with miniatures or vassal gaming or whatever. I can come up here and put in GCACW. I think it's listed under that. And yes, there's the Great Campaigns in the American Civil War right there. If I click on that, you can see there's 93 members of it. And you can subscribe to this, you can interact with the other members, and you can post right in here as well. So just a couple of resources there right on the Consim World site that are well worth your time to explore. And it's an additional option to get information about the game and get rules answers. And most of the folks that I've interacted with are very helpful. They're the ones that kind of fostered me along when I was learning the system. So you do want to take advantage of that. Alright, well, let's jump back over to the Vassal module here. And let's get started on the focus of this episode, which, as I promised, is going to be all about movement. In the preceding 2 episodes, I've talked about I've given you an overview of how the pieces work, what the information is that's shared on these pieces, and the map layout, and I talked about the initiative and the action cycle last time. So in this one, we're actually going to get very specific about one of the particular actions, and that is the movement of units around the map. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to explain the different levels of the way we can activate these units. And we also need to talk a little bit about the concept of zone of control, because that's going to become very important here. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll talk about the difference between activating individual divisions who will march by themselves, or when a leader activates the entire corps and you have subsequent units or units moving simultaneously. They will then have to move one at a time in order to simulate the command and control needed of moving those armies around into a confined space. So to get started here, let's talk first about the concept of zone of control. A lot of my older grognards out there, or grognards, I guess is the more appropriate pronunciation of it, are familiar with the fact that each one of these units here in a hex exert a control over all of the surrounding 6 hexes that they're adjacent to. And there's no difference to that concept here in the Great Campaign Series. There are a slight couple of exceptions to that, just depending on the type of terrain. So, looking at Pegram here, as I highlight him, he exerts a zone of control into all 6 surrounding hexes with no exception. And what that means in this title, or in the Great Campaign Series, is that as a unit from the enemy approaches, as soon as they enter that zone of control, they must stop. So if they have any movement points left, they forfeit the rest of their movement, and they must stop. And at that point, they may battle, which we will talk about in the next episode when we actually cover combat. But for all intent and purposes, if they are passing and they enter a zone of control of the enemy unit, they must stop. And then, of course, the decision becomes whether to just stop the action or continue on with combat. So you can see I've marked up here some arrows just to reinforce the concept that Pegram does, in fact, his stack exerts a zone of control over all 6 of the surrounding hexes. And what that would mean is, for example, if Wilder's unit were to come along, they would have to enter here and stop. So, or any of these, any of these roads that they encounter their zone of control for Pegram, they would stop. A new wrinkle that's been added to this particular series is a concept known as restricted zone of control. And all that means is that certain terrain types, specifically in this the woods hex sides here, anything where there's a woods where the hex is intervening between them would be, quote, the hex side for the woods. just means that the zone of control does not cross that hex side. So if I put Buckner's zone of control up here, like this, so you can see I've indicated by the arrows here that Buckner's zone of control covers 4 out of the 6 surrounding, the 5 of the six surrounding hexes. The requirement being that only those hex sides with the woods that are covered by or are connected by a road, as you can see here in 4433, because that road connects the two, that is considered a normal zone of control. But in 4332 here, because there's a wood hex side with no road in between them, then this is considered a restricted zone of control. Now, it doesn't make much of a difference here, but as we'll see, perhaps up in, here, where we have, say, Minty has a wood hex side in between him and this hex right here, that means a unit could pass by unimpeded if they just moved along through a restricted zone of control. So that's going to become important later on, and we'll talk about that in some examples later on in the recording. So how exactly do we move a unit? Well, we'll start, I'll give you 3 variations here. First we'll do a division, an individual division. Then we'll do a cavalry division. And then we'll do leadership, activating an entire corps, just to show you what multiple units all moving in succession would look like. So starting here with just a basic unit, I'll look at Hindman right down here. And we're going to activate him. Now, the important thing to know, and we're going to look at the charts here very quickly, and we're going to look at the movement costs and terrain effects. Those are going to be very important here. The way movement works here is that in most of the titles here, all Confederate units have an inherent +1 advantage on movement. So no matter what the die roll is for a division or a leader, the Confederate player is always going to get that extra +1. So that means here Hindman rolls a d6 when he's ready to move. Let's say I'm going to activate him. I would place a fatigue marker. He would get to go to fatigue level 1. And then I would roll a d6 to see what his movement is going to be. He rolls a 3, which becomes modified to a 4. That means this unit can exert 4 movement points to move however they like. Now, as I mentioned in a previous recording, the actual movement process is vitally important that you do so in the most efficient way possible. And in this game and on this map, you can see that the road network is really your best bet. Now, because Hindman here has no roads really connecting him to anything else, we can hide here real quick, and you can see he's sitting right here in a clear hex with no connecting roads. He's going to expend a little bit more in the way of movement points than somebody else that's already on a road. So let's look at the terrain chart here very quickly again. I'm going to pull this back up, and we look at the terrain effects, and you can see that right here in this column is the movement point cost. And the easiest way to travel across hexes without a road, you can see, is through obviously clear rolling. Those are only going to expend 3 movement points. Anything beyond that, you're getting very expensive. So his primary motivation here is probably to get to a road as quickly as possible. Since he wants to eventually engage the enemy, we could move him across this hex side here for 3 movement points. And that means he would have 1 movement point left over to spend however he wants. And we'll talk about in combat next time how you can use some of those leftover movement points to actually engage in an attack. But this would be 3 movement points for him to go from here to this hex across that hex side, because he's going from clear into a rolling hex. Now, if he was going to go from clear into this rough hex, that would cost 5 movement points. Now, he doesn't have that much, so that is a consideration you have to make. But he could also do something like this, where he would come up to 4032. He has 1 movement point left over, and he can always travel along a road for 1 movement point and come down to Freetown. And that would be all 4 of his movement points. So as you can see, this entire series really is, at its heart, just a roll and move game. You're looking at using a D6 just like you do in Monopoly. It's a poor example, I know, but it really is not very different. Now, one thing to understand that is sometimes you are going to roll poorly, and I am certainly the poster child for that. If you roll a 1, even with that extra 1 point, he's only going to get 2 movement points here. So, as a sort of a mercy rule, you can always move your division 1 hex in any direction, regardless of what your movement point generation is. So even if you only had 2 movement points and the cheapest way to go was 3, you can always move a division 1 hex across any kind of terrain type with the exception of swamps and mountains. You can always just move them from there to there, and let's say he wanted to move into the trees here on his next action, but he didn't have enough movement points, he could always do that and just move 1 hex. So there is the possibility of always being able to move as long as you don't have any barriers here like minor or major rivers or mountains. You can never cross any hex side with a mountain and a swamp here if it's flooded. Sometimes we have provisional swamps and we have complete swamps. For example, Moccasin Point here, if it did not have a road between them, then you would not be able to just move that 1 hex. And Union forces work exactly the same way. The only difference is they do not get that +1 bonus. So if I was going to activate Palmer as an individual division and move him, he would roll 1d6, and he gets a 3, and he gets no bonus modifiers to that. So he only has 3 movement points to expend. So he could then move out here, and as soon as he enters the zone of control of either Hindman or Polk and Cheatham, he would have to stop. He would not lose his final 2 points. He would then have the option to perform an attack on the march if he so desired. Cavalry work exactly the same way. The only difference is they have a higher mobility rate. So instead of rolling a 1d6, all cavalry units are going to roll 2d6 and then modify based on either being Confederate or, in this case, having a Confederate cavalry leader that would give him even more. So let's say Pegram activates Davidson. Well, normally Davidson just gets a normal +1. But Pegram, being a cavalry leader and a Confederate, is going to give him +2. So we'd first advance his fatigue to level 1, and then we'd roll 2d6, and he gets a 5. And we'd add 2 points to that. So he has 7 movement points to utilize. So we would come along here, just pick him up and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, staying completely on the roads. And then he would get to that point, and then we would roll for next initiative. And since I've segued into that, let's talk a little bit about the leader bonuses that you get. I'm going to pull up our charts again here. And we're going to look at the movement, and right here, I guess it's not in here, but on one of the other charts, they also show all of the variations of the leadership. But like I said, the easiest way to remember in your mind is Confederates always get that extra +1, so whatever the Union would get, you just kind of add 1 more to that. Union division is a d6, so that means a Confederate division is a d6 +1. A Union leader is a d6 +1, so that means a Confederate leader gives you +2. So it's very easy. Since we've seen individual divisions and cavalry move, let's talk about the more efficient way to move several units all at once, and that is with a leader activation. So let's say Walker wants to move his entire corps. He can do that by self-activating or making the leader active, and then activating all of the individual units to do the same marching orders. So the way we would do that is we'd issue a fatigue marker to each of them, saying that all 3 of them are being activated by Walker for a marching action. And then we find out what his movement point allowance is going to be. So Walker is a Confederate leader. He gets +2. I'd roll a d6. He gets a 3. I'm rolling a lot of 3s tonight. So that means all of the units then will get 5 movement points. Now it's important to understand that a lot of novice players will do this. They'll just pick up the stack and start moving at 1, 2, 3, etc. And you can't do that because there are movement costs, additional movement penalties that are incurred by moving a force into an area where there's already forces present. Just because you've got to, do some drill and you've got to get them parade ready and organized, and all the aspects of moving these large forces around into a confined area. So there are special rules here. Let's pull up the chart once again. And we look at the movement here. And right here in the upper left, we've got this occupied hex chart. And we can see that it indicates that if you have less than 3 manpower in a hex already, there's no effect either way. But most of the time, that's really only going to be representative of perhaps an artillery unit. So it's often advantageous for you to move your artillery units out in front of the other forces that are moving along the road. But if you have 3 to 11 manpower, if you are in any of these types here, you're going to add an additional movement point to just enter the hex with those other friendlies that are already there. And if it's a much more treacherous terrain, such as wood, swamp, or mountain, it's going to add the +3. And then when you get very large, some of the titles you're actually dealing with 15, 16, up to 18 manpower and larger. You can see that it gets very costly just to bring those forces together into the same hex, even in a mountain or a swamp or woods. So this becomes a factor when you're moving an entire corps of multiple divisions. So definitely want to keep an eye on that. In Walker's case, this is a prime example of that. We have probably the best choice for us to do is to move our artillery units out first, because then they can get there, get established, and because they have only 1 manpower in their unit, they're not going to cause the subsequent units to enter with any penalty. So it makes it a little easier for you to organize the units once they all march into place. So I could bring him here, and it's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Bring him to there. And then I might want to bring Walker's unit along as well. And he could get there. He could spend the full 5 to get to the same spot. But now, because I've got Liddell's division, because he's behind, now he goes 1, 2, 3, and he has 2 movement points left over. It would be 1 to enter this hex, because it's a normal 1, and then the +1 because there are already at least 3, but not quite 11 manpower already in there. So he has enough to use all 5 of his movement points to get right in there, and that way the stack is preserved as an entire corps. So as you're learning the system, do pay attention to when you're activating entire corps of divisions. Make sure that you do pay attention to how many movement points you have, and if you're trying to organize them so that they do end up in a same stack at the ending point of their march, then you have to calculate it appropriate so that you're not extending the first one too far that the other ones can't catch up. Just pay those extra movement points to get into the friendly hex. The other thing that you do want to make sure you do here, I'm going to pull them back into spot here, is when a corps does have 4 or 5 divisions, especially when you're playing this by email, you do want to designate which ones you're activating, because it's not always immediately obvious to your opponent if you are going to activate the entire stack, or if you have some, in the example of Polk and Cheatham here, he's got Hindman in the adjacent hex. It may not be advantageous for him to activate that unit. So you definitely want to declare if Polk's going to activate, whether or not he's activating both these divisions to perform some action, or just the one that he's with. More than anything, that's just good gaming etiquette, because you don't want to assume that your opponent is thinking the same way you are. Alright, so we've seen the basic mechanics of how a march works. Now we just have 2 or 3 other quick concepts, just some little exceptions to these rules and some other things that you want to make sure that you are aware of. And we should be able to wrap this up here in just a couple of minutes. When you are exiting a zone of control, then you must pay an additional movement point as a penalty for that first step out. So, for example, let's say Bragg is activating, Polk is activating Cheatham here. He's going to place a fatigue marker, and he wants to move away from Palmer's hex. He rolls his movement, gets a 5, so he has 7 movement points to work with. This first step that he takes away to move into this church area here would cost the 1 for the road and the additional 1 because he's exiting out of Palmer's zone of control. So that is something you want to pay attention to when you're calculating your movement rates away from other zones. Another important factor is if he wanted to move, say, from this hex to 3831 here, he wanted to just cross this hexide here, he could certainly do that. Whenever you move from one zone of control to another zone of control, because you have to stop anyway, and whenever you enter a zone of control, this would cost all of their movement points. So even though he had 7, it's still as though he's only moving from one hex to another. What's important about this is if there is not a road that's connecting these two hexes right here, what will happen is that division will, because of the chaos of moving just within the zones, this would flip them to disorganized. And that's not necessarily something that you want to do. Strategically, it may be useful for you, but that immediately takes you at a disadvantage when you're attacking, if you're going into a combat situation. So that's often kind of a last resort sort of thing if you were trying to set up a flank, which we'll talk about in combat. But if you can utilize the roads in between the two zones of control, you really want to do that as your highest priority. So let's move them back here. Let's talk about extended marches now. During the Civil War, as they were moving these units across several dozens or hundreds of miles over the period of days, these individual foot soldiers often got very tired, and they tended to straggle and, get distracted by things on the side of the road, such as farmhouses and apple orchards and whatnot. And this is simulated through the concept of extended march in this game. You'll notice on the fatigue markers here, fatigue level 1 has no ill effects. Fatigue level 2, however, if he gets to that, it says extended march if they're exhausted. And what that means is if, for whatever reason, they had achieved a fatigue level of 3 or 4 in the previous turn, on the previous day. I'm going to flip him over here so you can see. It's indicated by this white bar. That means that unit is exhausted, and they're more prone to straggling. And if that were to happen, then an extended march check would occur at fatigue level 2. But since this is the first day of the battle, we'll just assume they're okay. Normally, the extended march does not occur until you hit fatigue level 3. And at that point, what you do is you just roll a single die, and there are modifiers, of course, for the Union side because they are more prone to these extended march and straggling because they had such large armies. You'd roll a die, and this is a good example of that. If you get a 6 or higher, then what will happen is that unit will become disorganized, and they flip over. So they flip to that. That's if they were organized. If they were already disorganized and they failed their extended march check, then they start losing manpower due to the stragglers. And this is one of the dangers in this system of pushing your units too far and too fast, because you can actually cause more damage just by marching. If we look at our charts here again, at the movement, we can see here is the example of what's happening with the extended march. This is what will happen to them if they're organized. And if they're already disorganized and they have certain manpower strengths, they will actually start losing manpower. Now, the silver lining to this is that manpower loss does not count for most victory points in these scenarios. Those are usually only attributed to combat losses or retreat losses. So just losing them through the process of marching is not a negative factor, except it does make it harder for you to prosecute battle at that point. And as you can see, I've highlighted all the modifiers that will occur Normally it's when they go from arriving at 3 or arriving at 4, and it's +1 or +3 depending on whether or not they're exhausted. So if they're tired already and they're disorganized, they're going to suffer much worse not casualties, but disorganization effects than you would by just being a regular standing unit. So that is extended march, and you really want to pay attention to that, because that is something that you have to manage, especially when you have these large forces moving around. Buckner, you can see he has very large forces that are susceptible to it. The Union player is by far the most adverse because of this, because of the modifiers that are already added to their dice rolls. So +2, +3, +4 can very quickly add up, and it's almost just taken as granted that they will become disorganized or lose manpower through stragglers. The last thing I want to cover tonight is the the force march, which is when the division leader or the corps commander has to pull out that bayonet or the cat o' nine tails and force those units to move further and faster. This is kind of akin to Stonewall's foot cavalry, if you want to think of it that way. This is sort of a last resort way that you can add additional movement points to your march action. In this case here, I've got Palmer, and he wants to get up here to support Wilder, or maybe get up near Pegram. Because the Union is typically at a disadvantage for movement, it behooves them to figure out other ways to get some additional movement points. So Palmer is going to activate his division, and he's going to be activated by Crittenden. That will give him a +1. So I'm going to roll the die. He gets a 3, so that gives him 4 movement points. So he's going to come up here. It's 1 extra 1 to leave that zone of control. So he spent 2 there, 3, and then 4. But he still wants to go further. So he can, at this point, as long as his unit is currently organized, which it is, he could opt to do a force march. And what that will do is it will add additional movement points, but at the risk of losing to stragglers and the chaos of of poor leadership, because you're moving so far so fast. So the penalty is to first flip this to disorganized, and then you have to roll a die to see how many additional movement points you're going to get. Even if you roll a 1 or a 2, the most or the least you can always add is 2 movement points. So you're guaranteed to add 2 movement points to whatever you've got. So I'm going to roll the die here. I get a 2, and as you can see, normally what you do is you take this die roll and you subtract 1, and that gives you your additional movement points. But as long as it's 1 or a 2, you're always going to get the 2. So he rolled poorly, or I rolled poorly, which is normal, and I get 2 additional movement points. And because I did that, he's now going to lose a manpower. We look at our chart once again, and we look at movement. If we're going into force marching, once again, I cannot find that, but on my other chart here that I've got in front of me, when you do a force march, if it's a 1, you lose no manpower. If it's 2 through 5, you lose 1 manpower. And if it's a 6, natural 6, then you're going to lose 2 manpower. So in this case here, I would just reduce this by 1 step. It becomes a 5-8 now because he's disorganized. And he got 2 additional movement points. So I could move him 1 and then 2 to get him up here. So force marching is an extreme situation. You don't want to do it if you don't have to, but sometimes because we have such large maps and you want to get your forces to a strategic location as quickly as possible, sometimes you may need to, just by the requirements of the scenario. So what have we looked at tonight? Well, we talked all about movement. I've gone over the basic mechanics of how we move individual divisions, what happens when you activate them with a leader, and some of the bonuses that they get to that. we've talked about the zone of control concept. I'll give you another quick example of that here. Let's say I'm going to move these guys over here. Let's say Pegram was coming through here. Actually, move these a little farther here. Pegram was working his way through here, and he gets to this point because, I'm going to hide the units here for a second, because this is considered a Woods hex. This is inherently a Woods hex side, which means that the forces here do not exert a zone of control into Dyer's Mill. So Pegram can pass through there unimpeded, and he would go on to the next hex here, and you can see that's the exact same situation. There's a more contiguous series of woods in between the two hexes, so still no zone of control influence, and he could move into Cloud Church with no problem. So he could move through all three of these because they're only restricted zones of control. And it's only once he reaches right here that both of these units, the 123 Illinois and Steedman stack here, actually exert a zone of control into this hex. So calculating and utilizing some of those blind spots, if you want to think about it, where the restricted zones of control are key elements to movement, especially on this map. Down here in this area, you can see there are a lot of little corridors and avenues that you can sneak through by using those zones of control, or the restricted ones. So we've seen the additional concepts of zone of control and how that influences movement. We have looked at the elements of the extended march when we get units to 2, 3, and 4, like so, and the effects that will have on you by causing disorganization and manpower losses. And finally, we looked at, in Palmer's example here, how we can utilize the concept of the force march to add additional movement points voluntarily, but at the cost of becoming disorganized and potentially losing manpower that way. So everything that you need to know about movement is really just one of those things that you kind of experience on the fly. After your first couple of games, you can figure out quickly what is efficient movement. Obviously, the roads are going to pretty much direct all of your movement and channel your efforts toward that. But you're going to see that if you can avoid crossing hex sides that don't have roads, you're going to do that more times than not. And there are appropriate times to use that one hex movement to just get an entire stack from one place to the next, either because you don't have the movement points or because it's just strategically more advantageous for you to do it that way. So next time we're going to talk about the actual combat. We're going to prosecute a couple of individual attacks on the march, and then we're going to look at the full assault capabilities of these corps commanders. So I hope you come back. I hope these are helpful to you. If you have any feedback, please feel free to post them there in the BGG video log area, and I really appreciate it. I've gotten some excellent feedback and suggestions so far, and I hope you're finding these useful because I'm really enjoying doing it, and I will see you next time. Thanks.